welcome to this short video where I will show that there are solar parallels and astronomical parallels between the pagan triple goddesses Laserian and Bridget and their later Christian counterparts or incarnations, Saint Laserian and Saint Bridget. Okay, I believe that we're talking about the exact same deity, and I believe that the historical personas never existed and they were just attributes that were passed down in folklore and in oral tradition. So how did goddesses become saints in the first place? Okay, well, there was no real formal method of sainthood before the 10th century, which was when these historical personas were supposed to have existed. They were both supposedly alive in the, depending on what you read, the 4th or 5th century. So a saint was proclaimed more by popularity or by how strong the legend was. Usually the same motifs, symbols and numbers were carried forward into the Christian folk tradition, but usually this was because the monks translated the stories literally as opposed to understanding the allegory. Okay, we didn't have a counterpart to this because the Druids didn't write down their traditions because they felt it was sacred, and the Irish population at the time were illiterate. So basically what I'm hoping to show here is that there is still a sophisticated mathematical parallel within the two legends, and they both relate to the same phenomenon, which I hope to prove is the Easter equinox. Okay, and it's to do with the victory of light over darkness. Within the etymology of Laserian and Bridget as triple goddesses, we see that they describe the same thing. Their names actually mean the same thing. Laser means flame, and the pronoun to that is moles, which means my light or my flame. So it's not actually a name at all, it's actually a description. Bridget, usually translated in Catholic orthodoxy as the exalted one or high lady, is actually broken down by Lady Gregory as brioset, which means bright spear or bright flame or a bright arrow. Okay, so it's the same thing. We're talking about a ray of light. Okay, so Bridget and Laserian, the triple goddesses, their name means the same thing. Okay, we then take a look at the aspects of these deities. Triple goddesses. Is there a reason why they were triple goddesses? Okay, well, the goddesses at that time were associated with both the sun and the moon. Okay, and in the moon we have three strong phases which are represented throughout religions and mythologies. Okay, all the way up to today we have the waxing of the moon, the full moon and the waning moon. Okay, so there's 3 stages, and that relates to, again, in paganism and in mythology we have the maiden, the mother and the crone. In solar connotations, of course, we have the sun rising from the 21st of December all the way up to the 21st of June and then back down again. So we have a strong connection to the number 3. And in Pythagorean numbers, of course, number 3 is the symbol of new life. So in Pythagorean numbers, number 1 is everything. It's God, if you like. Number 2 is the breakaway from that. It's, for some people, the mother aspect. Okay, so you have 1 and 2, but when you put these two together, you get a symbol called a Viscia Piscis, and you can see that in religious imagery all the time. Usually you might see a form of Jesus or a pagan saint or a god or a goddess within it. Okay, and it's just showing that from 1 and 2 we get new life. So number 3 is very, very important here, and we'll see why numbers, symbols and again mathematical ideas within the folklore of these saints is still passed down without people actually knowing why. So when we look at Saint Bridget and Saint Laserian, the Christian personas, we have to look first of all to see whether there's any basis in fact for their existence. The first life of Bridget was written by a bishop called Cogitosus, and he wrote this text in 800 AD, which is hundreds of years after this saint supposedly lived. The same with Saint Lazarian. The first mention of Saint Lazarian comes from a document called the Martyrology of Angus, and this is in 820 AD, and again it's hundreds of years after this person supposedly lived. And I've noticed that an awful lot of anecdotes to do with Lazarian and going over to the Pope to dispute the dating of Easter comes from a document called the Salamanca manuscript. Now this was a 14th century collection of medieval lives, so we have to doubt whether any of it is based on fact at all, especially when you look at how many years after the people living it actually came. Okay, so Cogitosus wrote about Bridget, as we've said, and he incorporated an awful lot of solar motifs into the Saint Bridget from the pagan triple goddess Bridget. Why would he have done that? Well, if you think about it, he's setting up a settlement, and he's taking over a pagan shrine. So first of all, he has to associate his own saint with someone that the population already knew. In this context, he could bring in pilgrims, he could bring in money, and in order to best do that, he needed someone who performed miracles, someone who could perform wonders, and he needed someone that the people already could recognize. Remember, the people were illiterate, so most of the knowledge that they had came from an oral and folk tradition, and the best way to preserve that was to make the stories as amazing as possible so that they would be retold over and over again. Now Cogitosus took over a shrine dedicated to the goddess Bridget, and it was known as Culdara. Now this has connections to Kildare. Kildare wasn't actually a county yet, because Kildare wasn't established as a county until the 13th century at the Synod of Reit Brasil. But the shrine was at Culdara, and Culdara is a Gaelic word for Temple of the Oak. So straight away we see that there's a Druid pagan connection in that, because the oak was sacred to the Druids. Now the goddess Bridget, her temple was tended by 19 virgins. They were called the Daughters of the Flame. And 19 is a number that crops up with Bridget, and in ancient archaeology quite a lot. So there's no coincidence there. So we'll come back to 19. We'll bear it in mind along with the number 3. Okay, as we've also said, then Lazarian, Bridget, Brio says they all mean the same thing. They all mean fire. They all mean an attribute of the sun or fire. So for Lazarian as well, there's no hard evidence to say that he actually did exist, or that he went to Rome to change the Easter date. But there is a connection between the goddess Lazarian and Easter, and also the changing date of Easter. Now, is it a coincidence that the Saint Lazarian is also associated with the changing date of Easter? I don't think so. I think it's just a literalization of this astronomical process. Can we find common folklore between the pagans and between the pagan variation and the Christian variation of Bridget and Lazarian? Well, actually we can. Apart from their names, we also have origin, if you want to think of it in superhero terms, origin stories. Bridget, Saint Bridget decided to become a nun, apparently, by plucking out her eye to prove to her father that her love for God was greater than any desire to be married. So she maimed herself in order to prove her love of God and wisdom. That's actually an echo of the Odin myth, which is a solar... Odin was also a sun god. and Odin took out his own eye, and he gave it up in order to gain wisdom as well. So there's a parallel there. Laserian has a story to do with the eye as well, which is another solar motif. And for Laserian, he met someone who had a cursed eye or eyelash or eyebrow, depending on the version of the story you read. And at sunrise, Laserian supposedly looked at this eye or eyebrow, and he became cursed and died. To me, this is the motif of the Easter equinox, because the sun is actually becoming so bright again, it's actually conquered darkness. Now, at the end of this video, I will try to show you why the vernal equinox is Bridget and why the vernal equinox is Laserian, okay? A second common folk story to do with Bridget and Laserian is that Bridget wanted to get some land for her Christian settlement. So she went to a pagan lord, and he joked, he said, you can have the amount of land that your cloak covers. So she threw down her cloak on the ground, and it began to extend until she had more than enough land. This exact same story is also attributed to Laserian's origins, where he went to a pagan lord, said the same thing, and his cloak grew and grew, and he had more than enough land. Now, to me, that's another solar connection. I believe that the cloak is just an allegory for the lengthening sun. Okay, the lengthening sun comes about at Easter time after the vernal equinox. It's not a coincidence that these sun goddesses have the exact same folklore. But what does that actually mean to us then? And can we see number 19, can we see number 3, and can we see a connection between the pagan Laserian changing an Easter date and the Christian Laserian changing an Easter date? Okay, well, let's have a look. When we have two triple goddesses representing the same characteristics at the same time of the year, we have to look a little bit deeper into that, especially when we see that the breakdown of their names actually mean the same thing. So we know that Bridget is associated with Imbolc, which is a festival that occurs on February the 1st, okay? Now, in this context, we can see that Imbolc is a pagan feast day too. It's the midpoint between the December 21st solstice and the vernal equinox. But Bridget is a triple goddess, which means her other incarnations are celebrated a little bit further than Imbolc, okay? So we're still talking about springtime, but it seems to be a general seasonal celebration as opposed to the tradition of one particular day for Bridget. And we can see that Laserian seems to have the same attributes, except Laserian is specifically connected to the vernal equinox simply because of the saints' association with the changing of the Easter date. Now, why would that be? So what exactly happens at Easter, and what is the vernal equinox? Well, the vernal equinox is when the hours of light finally match the hours of darkness out of winter, and from that point onwards the hours of light are more than the hours of darkness. Okay, so light has conquered the darkness, and throughout history sun gods have always been associated with that moment, Jesus being the most famous contemporary example, where Jesus is supposed to have risen on Easter Sunday on the vernal equinox. But if we look at that symbolically, what it's really about is the sun conquering darkness, life conquering death, if you like. Okay, so when we have that significance, we can't underestimate how important that was for ancient people. And for these two triple goddesses They both have particular connections to this moment in the year. As we mentioned earlier, it was significant that Bridget is associated with the number 19, okay? And 19 has many solar and lunar connotations, and is a very significant number in scientific terms, okay? But for example, this is just an aside, and we'll see how all these things are related, because it comes down to my own theory that we're talking about the same deity, and that same deity, the sun, was celebrated in different forms, but it was still the same sun, okay? So, for example, Professor Michael J. O'Kelly, who was the person who restored Newgrange, he discovered that the Newgrange passage, for example, down which the sun travels, is 19 meters. Now, as we know, when it comes to these monuments, every number was completely deliberate. There were no accidents, okay? So there's an example of 19. Now, 19 turns up quite a lot in stone circles as well. For example, in Boscawen Un, or also the Merry Maidens, people can look those circles up. They have 19 stones. So why 19, and what significance has 19 got in relation to Easter? Well, 19 is the number of the Metonic cycle. Now, the Metonic cycle is basically the amount of years it takes the moon to travel in order to return to its exact same position in the sky in the exact same phase. So if you saw a full moon in the sky at a particular point in the sky, you won't see that occur again until 19 years later. Okay, now you may see another full moon, but the moon won't actually be in that position again. Okay, so this is called the Metonic cycle. Now this was attributed to the Greek philosopher Meton, who said he discovered it, but we've since found out that the Metonic cycle has been known for thousands of years. It was known in Babylon, it was known in China, and as we continue to uncover monuments that are aligned to the sun or the moon, for example another monument at Newgrange, the Mound of the Hostages, is aligned to the sun on Imbolc, which we have just seen is one of Bridget's feast days. But yeah, as we begin to uncover more and more of these monuments, we'll see that they are aligned to the sun or the moon on particular dates, okay? So this now gives new resonance to the fact that Bridget was supposed to have had 19 maidens, okay? So 19 maidens now looking after this sun goddess, okay? And this sun goddess being associated in this context with Easter and the vernal equinox, okay? So now we're going to get this amalgamation of the sun motif and the moon motif. And bear in mind here, moonlight is not generated from within the moon. Moonlight is sunlight. It's reflected sunlight. Now this concept has a very long history, and it's another video entirely to connect the moon to the idea of the unconscious mind and reflection and so on, and maybe we'll go into that another time. But for now, it's just worth noting the connection between the moon and the sun in this context, and also why we're going to pair Bridget with Lazarian, because Lazarian, as a saint, supposedly changed the Easter date, okay? But as we can see now, from the idea of the Metonic cycle, we also have to consider a concept called computus. Now computus, I won't go into here, you can look it up. It's basically to do with the dating of Easter and how it changes in relation to moon phases. But what we can say is computus and Lazarian, if you strip away the idea of Lazarian as a name and instead think of Lazarian as an attribute, we see that they are inextricably linked. Okay? And this brings us now to the point of my theory where I believe Bridget and Laserian are actually just allegories for the vernal equinox at a point, but also for the metaphor of springtime and the changing of the guard, if you like, from darkness being in charge to the sun being in charge, daylight being in charge. So when we think about how long, for example, Newgrange was signifying the solstice without us knowing about it, thousands of years, and it's only since Professor Michael J. O'Kelly's work from the 60s onwards that we actually got to uncover the significance of Newgrange. We have to reassess how we think about these monuments. Their astronomical significance is only now becoming apparent, and there are many reasons for this. One in particular is the way the system works shows that an expert in one area just does not have the broad knowledge to measure different disciplines. We're talking about like archaeology, astronomy and history, for example. So in the relatively new discipline of archaeoastronomy, now we're able to see that there are alignments behind these monuments. One particular person who's doing great work at the moment is Ronan Murray, and he has a book called Secrets of Drombeg. Now what Ronan is drawing attention to is the knowledge that these ancient people had, and they were able to create alignments between the circles and the sun and the moon, and in particular demonstrating that this knowledge that we thought was in Babylon and China was also here in Ireland. So that's really a game changer for us when we think about the Metonic cycle and the way these processes were then personified and anthropomorphized. Okay. If we can try to imagine how light and darkness affected the ancient people, we can then see why it was so important to mark these moments in the year, these equinoxes and solstices. Okay, so the two solstices and the two equinoxes, which were known as the four corners of the earth, although they didn't signify that the ancients thought the world was square or anything like that. It was just the four pillars that held up the year. Okay. Light meant warmth, it meant food, and it meant safety, relatively speaking, from the elements. Okay. So it's no coincidence that the sun became goddesses with more than one aspect. Okay, so we see in Bridget and in Laserian we have the kind of, if we want to equate it to the moon again, so we have the waxing almost, so the rising, so we have the young version, the maiden, and then we have the mother, where the moon is full. In terms of the sun, it's around the 21st of June, and from that moment onwards then it's waning. Okay, the sun is actually moving back down towards the autumnal equinox, which is the opposite to the Easter equinox, in that the hours of darkness then equate to light and then become stronger. There are more hours of darkness than light until we get to the 21st of December, which is the darkest point, where there is most dark and the least amount of light. And gradually then from the 21st of December, light begins to catch up until the moment of the Easter equinox, when they are equally matched, and from that moment onwards there's more hours of light than darkness until June the 21st, which is midsummer, where light is at its very strongest, and from that point onwards darkness begins to catch up again until the autumn equinox. So my theory, based on what I can find, is that Bridget and Lazarian are personifications of springtime, in particular of the sun at springtime. And during this research, like, I've had to make certain decisions. There's a lot more to this. There are things I've had to leave out, and decisions I've made. For example, someone might say, "Oh, you're saying that Cogitosis wrote the first life of Bridget," and yet, if someone goes to look up Wikipedia, for example, they'll see that there's a supposed character called Brocken Clowen who wrote a life of Bridget in 650 AD. Now, I've looked into that and I can't find any proof that this is a real person. I've found amalgamations of characters who have transcribed pagan myths, but even if you think that the Christianized version of Bridget is still holding pagan motifs now, the Brocken Clowen version it's even stronger. So we can't actually, there is no person. Okay, if someone can prove that there is, I'll gladly edit this video. So what I've really discovered is that you have to make decisions based on the facts available to you, and the facts available to us tell us more clearly that the ancient people were celebrating a moment of change in the year than the Christianized versions were telling us that there was a person going around fixing decapitated heads or plucking out their eyes. Okay, so these are allegories, and it's difficult sometimes to make that change from reading things literally to reading things symbolically. And that was the mistake that the first monks made when they transcribed the stories of these goddesses. They didn't have the understanding. They didn't have the astronomical knowledge that the builders of these monuments had. So bear in mind, you know, as much as we're talking about Bridget and Lazarian as personifications of the sun, the way they were mortalized, if you want to use that word, or given an earthly representation, was through the monuments. Okay, so Bridget with having 19 maidens, for example, would be one aspect of that. And in conclusion, we can see that the reason why we need to look beyond literalization of these saints is that while the Christians wrote their history, and like as usual, like the history is written by the winners, but the Christians wrote the history in words on paper. And I think we can say that the ancient people wrote their history in symbol, in stone, and in star. So these things are not as easily read, and it takes a bit more effort, but when we do finally see them, we can see that they are much more apparent. So I hope you like this video. It's probably new territory for some people, and I'll have another one up soon. Thanks for watching. The Exalted One, or High Lady, is actually broken down by Lady Gregory as Brioset, which means bright spear or bright flame or bright arrow. Okay, so it's the same thing. We're talking about a ray of light. Okay, so Bridget and Lazarian, the triple goddesses, their name means the same thing. Okay, we then take a look at the aspects of these deities. Triple goddesses. Is there a reason why there are triple goddesses? Okay, well, the goddesses at that time were associated with both the sun and the moon. Okay, and in the moon we have three strong phases, which are represented throughout religions and mythologies. Okay, all the way up to today we have the waxing of the moon, the full moon, and the waning moon. Okay, so there's 3 stages, and that relates to, again, in paganism and in mythology, we have the maiden, the mother, and the crone. In solar connotations, of course, we have the sun rising from the 21st of December all the way up to the 21st of June and then back down again. So we have a strong connection to the number 3. And in Pythagorean numbers, of course, number 3 is the symbol of new life. So in Pythagorean numbers, number 1 is everything. It's God, if you like. Welcome to this short video where I will show that there are solar parallels and astronomical parallels between the pagan triple goddesses Laserian and Bridget and their later Christian counterparts or incarnations, Saint Laserian and Saint Bridget. Okay, I believe that we're talking about the exact same deity, and I believe that the historical personas never existed and they were just attributes that were passed down in folklore and in oral tradition. So how did goddesses become saints in the first place? Okay, well, there was no real formal method of sainthood before. Basically, what I'm hoping to show here is that there is still a sophisticated mathematical parallel within the 2 legends, and they both relate to the same phenomenon, which I hope to prove is the Easter equinox, okay, and it's to do with the victory of light over darkness. Within the etymology of Laserian and Bridget as triple goddesses, we see that they describe the same thing. Their names actually mean the same thing. Laser means flame, and the pronoun to that is moles, which means my light or my flame. So it's not actually a name at all, it's actually a description. Bridget, usually translated in Catholic Orthodoxy as before the 10th century, which was when these historical personas were supposed to have existed. They were both supposedly alive in the, depending on what you read, the 4th or 5th century. So a saint was proclaimed more by popularity or by how strong the legend was. Usually the same motifs, symbols and numbers were carried forward into the Christian folk tradition, but usually this was because the monks translated the stories literally as opposed to understanding the allegory. Okay, we didn't have a counterpart to this because the Druids didn't write down their traditions because they felt it was sacred, and the Irish population at the time were illiterate. So